Good evening, Consul General, friends, and colleagues. My name is Caroline Hafey, and I'm the Assistant Director here at Glucksman Ireland House. Welcome, everybody, to our first event in our public events series for spring 2023. It is the eagerly awaited launch of Vona Groarke's Hereafter, The Telling Life of Ellen O'Hara, and we're delighted that you can all be with us this evening. Yes. A special welcome to Ireland's Consul General, Helena Nolan, who will introduce Vona Groarke this evening, and to Professor Martha Hodes, the Interim Director of the Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. In Hereafter, the latest book in the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series published with NYU Press, Vona Groarke brilliantly recreates the life of her great-grandmother, who emigrated from Sligo to New York in 1882 to work as a servant. Combining deep archival research with a writer's imagination, she has produced what the Irish Independent calls a beautifully distinctive exercise in imaginative empathy. Hereafter arose directly out of Vona's time as a Coleman Fellow at the New York Public Library, which recurs as a motif throughout the book. I'm delighted, therefore, to introduce the renowned NYU historian, Professor Martha Hodes, to say a few words on behalf of the Coleman Center. And Consul General Helena Nolan will introduce Vona, who will be in conversation with our director, Kevin Kenny, standing in for Dr. Kelly Sullivan, who had to withdraw at the last minute, unfortunately, for health reasons. Just a few housekeeping things. We'll ask everyone to silence all cell phones because we are in person in the house again, so please silence all cell phones if you can. The conversation will run for about a half hour or so, followed by a discussion with the audience. The program will end around 8:15, after which we'll invite all of you to join us downstairs for a reception and some light refreshments and a book signing. And now I will turn it over to Martha Hodes. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Lovely. I'm Martha Hodes. I'm Interim Director of the Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, where Vona was a fellow in 2018-19. And it was at the Coleman Center that Vona conceived of Hereafter, and we're so happy to be co-presenting this event with Ireland House this evening. As Vona writes in the book, Hereafter, her words, arose out of a chance encounter with Ellen, the book's protagonist, one lunch break archive search during my fellowship at the Coleman Center. By way of background, the Coleman Center selects 15 fellows each year from an international pool of applicants. Our fellows are among the best and most promising academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, and artists at work today. They come to the New York Public Library to gain intensive access to our collections in order to write the books of tomorrow, as we like to say. And as it happens, Vona and I were in the same class of fellows, and what a pleasure that was. Thinking about this evening, I went back to the notes I took during Vona's presentation to her fellow fellows of her work in progress that year when she was starting out on the book that would become Hereafter. There was, she said that day, a good story to be told here. She described her work to us as both creative and historical. She told us that she wanted to take a risk with both form and content. She wondered that day how Ellen might tell her own story in her own voice. Vona spoke that day about poetry, lyric prose, and historical fact. Hereafter is an extraordinary work about an ordinary person. It's a book for poets, it's a book for historians, it's a book for all readers. I'm going to end with a confession. I've not quite finished the book because each time I open it, I find myself savoring only a few pages at a time. I just want it to last for weeks and weeks. Maybe some of you are in the same situation this evening. I can't wait to hear Vona talk about Hereafter. Thank you, Vona.
Thank you. I can't wait to hear Vona either, so I promise you I'm not going to delay any of you for too long. But just a few introductory remarks, and I'll start. Maybe you ended with a confession. I'll start with a confession. I'm entirely biased here. I've known Vona and her work for a very long time, and I absolutely love it. I have every single one of her poetry books. I've loved every one of them. I love the beauty of her poetry and also the intelligence of her work. So it's an absolute honour and privilege to be here with you this evening. And well done for organising this. And thank you, Vona, for being here. There were many, I should say as well as being a great poet, Vona is a great teacher. And I've benefited a little bit from her teaching skills in the past. There are many, many moments in this beautiful book, the stunning writing that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. I don't want to reveal too much, and I know we're going to hear a lot about it in the conversation, but one of the early phrases in the book was when Vona says, "I'm the descendant of people who survived somehow the famine." And of course, it suddenly dawned on me in that moment that that's what we all are, and I feel almost a luckier person immediately just from reading those words. The book as well, I know, is part of the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series with NYU Press, so well done to everyone. It's had superb reviews. It's an absolutely beautiful book. It's a real feat of the imagination and creativity, but also there's real love and pride in there. I think as well as being a book for everyone, it is a book for women too, right? And I have this hashtag for a few years, hashtag Visible Women. This book makes visible the invisible. It gives voice to lost voices that need to be heard. It's really appropriate to celebrate it in the month of February. It's the month of Bridget the Goddess and Saint Bridget, and one of Ireland's patron saints. It's a month when we celebrate the creativity of Irish women and our diaspora women. And, this book and that whole festival of Bridget helps to retrieve even the name Bridget from the kind of music hall, comic, stereotypical, prejudiced joke slur and gives Bridget her full glory. So to turn to Vona herself, if I was to read her full biographical note, we'd need several hours, I think, to sing her praises. But to say that since her first collection was published in 1994, Vona has published 12 books, including 8 poetry books, many essays, selected poems. She has been inducted into the Irish Literary Hall of Fame, and this book is her most recent publication, which, as we've heard, arose out of her time as a Cullman Fellow here in New York. And she's taught at the University of Manchester since 2007 and is current writer-in-residence at St John's College, Cambridge University in the UK, and she's working on a whole lot of other projects. Not surprised at all to see that. Essays on poems and poetry, wonderful to see. She's working on a sequence of new poems as well. But I think instead of me talking about all that, what we really want to do is hear from Vona. So let me sit down and allow the wonderful Vona Groarke to share her thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I think everybody should be able to hear me on this mic. Is that right?
Not really. Okay. If I say something, can you hear me? No. No. Okay. Something's happening with the sound. It'll be okay.
We'll start. Vona, welcome. I've been looking forward to this evening for such a long time. You arrived in New York in 2018
Yes.
at the Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars. It couldn't be more appropriate given the book that you wrote. Not with this idea, I suspect.
Yeah.
And then you had a chance encounter. I don't know if you want to tell us about the idea you had, but I'd love to hear about the chance encounter.
The idea that I had was to write poems. And I came fully intending to do that, and I had a subject matter that I was going to write poems about. And to be honest, that's the altogether wrong place to ever start with poems, with a subject matter, because it just seems like, you know, it's almost the least important decision. And I found that the rigor of being in the Cullman Centre, which is so wonderful in terms of a project like this, didn't actually suit the writing of poems. I've never written poems sitting at a desk in an office Monday to Friday before, and when faced with it, I quickly realised I don't think I can do it. So I was very, very happy to encounter Ellen and to think, here's a story actually that I can work with. And here's a story that I can actually use what's in the Cullman Centre in order to propel the story and to excavate the story insofar as it's possible to do so. So it was actually a much better idea in terms of where I was than the original idea that I had. And the original idea I had, I might do it some other time. It's still possible that I'll pick it up, but I think really whether it was happenstance or just me actually in some way, maybe subconsciously working it out, this was a better project for where I was in the Cullman Centre, yeah.
So there's a lovely section in the book called Not My Ellen. So you're in search of Ellen, and you run through, I think, no fewer than 15 possible Ellens, one of whom dies in a subway explosion, one of whom makes it to deputy commissioner in the NYPD. My colleague Kelly Sullivan commented, these are almost prompts for short stories, every one of them. And I wondered, did you let your imagination run riot on them as well? Did you wonder about all the other possible Ellens?
Well, so much of the story of Ellen O'Hara that a certain amount of it, not necessarily the overwhelming proportion, but a certain amount of it is makey-uppy stuff, because it's actually not possible for me to locate all the information that I would seek to locate in relation to her life. Like I don't know an awful lot of it. I didn't find her in ways that I had hoped to find her. So I had to supply imagination to fill in those gaps. And I always admit when I'm doing that, because I don't want to pass off creative work as if it were historical fact. It's very important to me that I distinguish between them. So I usually make it quite clear that I am being creative in this bit where I'm imagining or projecting. But with these Ellens, I thought, okay, so here's 15 different women who lived, most of them lived around about the same time as my Ellen, and they have stories that are the product of historical fact. So what I have of them in here is taken from newspapers or is boiled down from newspaper reports. So there isn't a single word that I've added to their stories that wasn't in the telling of their story wherever I found it. And I wanted to do it that way because here are 15 Ellens who actually are verifiable. And then there's my Ellen, who seems to fall through quite a few different kind of cracks because she wasn't a woman of property, she wasn't a woman of social status, she didn't own any place that she ever lived in. So the records that I do find of her are in census records, passenger manifests on the transatlantic liners, in Polk's directory she pops up there, but it's not enough to tell of the full span of a life. So I have to, if you like, occupy her story by other means. But these 15 Ellens, it's the bare bones of their story, and some of them are kind of impressive, and some of them are kind of tragic. And she could have had a better life in better circumstances, but she also could have had a worse life in worse circumstances. Yeah.
So there are so many twists and turns as you try and locate your Ellen, and I think a bit like Professor Hodes, I found myself reading the book slowly and savouring each one of them. What were the moments in the research or the writing of the book when you felt you knew her best, when you came closest to your Ellen, And then conversely, what were the moments when she remained elusive? Because both are in the book.
The moments when she remained elusive were all the kind of formal ways that I was looking for her. The moments when she kind of cohered into something like a personality, that's really easy for me to answer, because the moment at which I heard her voice, so the moment at which I imagined her sitting in the chair across, so in the Cullman Centre you have your desk, you have your computer, and then you have another desk, and there's a chair in the corner. And I imagined her one day sitting in the chair, and I imagined what kind of clothes would she be wearing, and I looked up what kind of clothes she might potentially be wearing. And I imagined her, and I filled in her outline with my imagination, and then I heard her voice. And now, obviously, I'm not trying to pretend that, it was her ghost or anything. As I claim no ghosts were harmed in the making of this book, but certainly I was able to hear something that I said, it's not entirely my voice. There's something in there that's not 100% Vona, that it sounds in the way that a fiction writer will hear the voice of a character. That's what was happening. And that's the point at which I thought, I think I can make something happen with her voice, with her story, with her character. I think I want to make her kind of a little bit willing, but also quite a bit unwilling. I don't want her to be just a patsy for the story. I want her to argue with me. I want her to resist what I'm doing with her story. I want her to be a little sort of proud, really. And so that's, when she speaks with a mixture of these different emotions. But that's, if I'd never heard that voice in my head, I wouldn't have been able to write the book.
So, Irish emigration in this period, the period that the book is set, is highly distinctive. Indeed, it is unique in certain respects, both in its scale and in its gender composition. So one of the things that makes Irish migration stand out is that roughly half of the migrants were women. And even more than that, they were young single women. That's what's truly distinctive. Ellen was one of them. And I wondered, as a historian as well as a poet, what you learned from this about that larger pattern. For example, there's a line a passage in the book that I love where Ellen's husband, John, he does not acquit himself well in the narrative. No spoiler alert there. And you speculate, as author, that he left her. But Ellen pushes back, and she says, maybe it was me left John. So could you talk a little bit more about the context for women's migration?
I don't actually know what happened to John O'Grady. I don't know, except that I know that he wasn't part of the story. So there's all the research that I did. There's everything that I found out about women who were like Ellen. There's the very few things I found out about Ellen. And then the other ingredient is the fact that she was a family member, and that my mother had lived with her for the first 12 years of her life before she went back with her immediate family back to Ireland. So my mother had stories of her, and she used to tell me those stories, and I never heard her mention her grandfather in any of those stories, except to say she told me that he had been killed in a subway incident, that he had been murdered in the subway, but I never heard her say anything else about him. So I knew that he wasn't a very strategic part of the story, let's put it that way. So then I had to think, right, well, what could have happened to him? And through my research you see, it's a period that, as you well know, Kevin, because I use some of your historical research as well, it's a period that has attracted a lot of really good historians to study it. So I drew on people who studied the work of Irish domestic servants, Irish immigrants, Irish women, Irish marriage patterns, Irish settlement patterns, how communities were formed in Ireland, language patterns. So a lot of this research has been done. So I was able to study it, and I found out, and as I put in the book, the fact that desertion rates were very high amongst Irish immigrant couples, largely because while women were working in mills and as domestic servants, well, domestic servants mostly when they weren't married, but men were working in more migratory labour jobs, so they had to go out to get the jobs, and then they weren't at home, and sometimes it didn't seem like their home life was something that was very stable for them. So for this and for other reasons, desertion rates or marriage breakdown rates were quite high. So I thought, well, I think this is probably what happened. Without saying authoritatively, this is definitely what happened. This is probably what happened. So I think it's like a mixture of kind of family evidence, historical evidence, and just this character who, I think with historical characters, when you create them, you create them so you know a certain amount about them, but I think they always hold something back. I think maybe every character might not just be historical characters, but I think they hold something back, and that's what keeps you digging, or keeps you scratching, or keeps you asking, how does this work? What happened? Can you find out more about it? So I didn't want Ellen to be a pushover. I didn't want to have this character sit and say, yeah, my husband left me. And this is what happened to me then. I thought, well, it's much more interesting if she says, what are you even doing asking these questions? And who are you? And where's your husband? And what right do you have to ask me? So I thought it was more fun for me as well to listen to that voice, as opposed to listen to a voice that was compliant with my desires at all time.
So I read Hereafter as both as a work of literature and as really a sustained reflection on the historian's craft.
Yeah.
And the result, the Irish Independent called it a beautifully distinctive exercise in imaginative empathy. And I think that imaginative empathy actually is at the heart of the historian's craft as well as the poets. So I wanted to turn the conversation a little to how you achieve this through literary form, because it's very distinctive what you do. You choose and perhaps loosely adapt a form of the sonnet. You call it the folk sonnet. And it's an Italian variant of that with the volta, or the turn, or the pivot. I suppose after the first 8 lines, or somewhere between the 8th line and the 9th line, the pivot takes place. And it seems perfectly appropriate for Ellen. So how did you come up with that? When did that form present itself to you as the vehicle or the medium?
It came pretty quickly, because the sonnet has this incredible history where it is both a highly literary device, very wrought, very decorative in some usages, and then sometimes it has business to do, and it has ground to cover. And so it seemed to me a fairly good literary device for carrying a voice. So I thought, okay, I need to be able to distinguish, I need to find a way that will distinguish between my voice as the researcher writer, the places where I'm sort of, letting rip as a sort of poor man's fiction writer, the places where I am deploying this kind of lyric voice that is mostly self-reflective, watching myself doing what I'm doing in the book. And she can't sound like that, or else it's a dull book, because there needs to be a different tone. And I thought, okay, so what form will that tone take? And I tried it in prose, and it didn't work, and it was inclined to go on a bit and to be too rangy, and I was going into places that I really didn't need to go. And the sonnet was a way of being economical and being thrifty, and also just carrying the voice with as little faff as possible.
So is that what you mean when you call it a boxy form?
Yeah. There's not that much wastage in a sonnet, really. I mean, there are examples of sonnets that are, quite ornamental, but actually, mostly sonnets, as I say, they have business to do. They've got a point to argue. They've got something that needs to get said, and the volta sort of allows a shift that will also service that telling. So the way that the sonnet usually watches itself telling a point, or narrating a feeling, or whatever it is that the sonnet is doing, it seemed to me that seemed to work for the voice.
except that it's not a simple conflict and resolution, and this is what I loved about the book. It's as you put it, it's sometimes a pivot into silence.
Yeah.
Right. So I think as I read it, what you're doing as a poet is you're filling in the gaps and the silences up to a point.
Up to a
because
point.
you also want to, just as powerfully, I think, leave some of the silences intact. And so we have Ellen described at one point as your ghost writer. Think about that, your ghost writer. And you describe her also as complicit in the silence. And at one point you ask her a question, and she says, that's the wrong question. It's a question about money. But she doesn't tell you the right question.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more? Tell us more about playing with silence.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a story that hasn't been told, and yet that has like so much texture in it. Because, as I say, her story was told to me by my mother, and some of my brothers and sisters are here too, and they'll know those stories too. So the story was told to me in some respects, but it wasn't. It wasn't ever. It never had any foothold in the official record, or very, very slight foothold. So, yes, that meant that there were absences in the telling. There were things that I was not able to discover, and that I didn't feel entirely comfortable just, deciding for myself how those things should go. For example, I don't know what happened to her after my mother left with her family and came back to Ireland. I don't know. And you said, and I can see exactly why you said it, that she left Ireland in 1882. Maybe she did and maybe she didn't. So I know when she was born, because I have a baptismal certificate for her. But when I went looking for when she came over to America from Ireland, I found several people of her name and the right age. So I just had to pick one. You just, at that stage, you just say, well, okay, so it doesn't make a huge difference. So if you say it's the city of Berlin instead of the city of Hamburg, I've no way of knowing which is the right one, so here's what I'm doing. So I think the important thing is that you don't say she definitely came, but that in the book you say, well, I'm just going to say that she came on this one instead of that one. So always gaps, always absences, always a hiatus in the telling, and that's what's so fascinating for me, is that some of it I could occupy and some of it I wasn't able to occupy, and I have no right to occupy. And there are parts in the story where I hold back and say, I've no business trying to imagine this, because actually this must have been a moment lived so intensely that I don't actually have the equipment to be able to project myself into it. So I just have to stand back from it and say, imagine it for yourselves, really. I'm not going to try and pretend I was there. So yes, the gaps, the silences, her kind of saying, basically, go away from me, not be annoying me with your questions. That's all part of it too. I imagine that anybody, in the same way that we all protect our own privacy, we protect our own solitude insofar as we can. Why wouldn't ghosts do that too? I think they'd have more reason to do it.
So one source we use quite a bit is letters,
Yep.
and letters, of course, play a very particular role, and we might get to that in this story. Just in my own graduate seminar the other day, we were talking about the immigrant letter, and we used an example. There's an Irish painter in the, I think, 1830s, Gerald Brennan, and there's a painting called The American Letter, and it's a scene in an Irish rural household. Three women and a man, as I recall. The youngest of the women is reading the letter from America. She's the most likely to be literate. The man is kind of over in the corner, more intent on what he's holding in his right hand. He's going through the motions of listening to the news from America, but he's holding in his right hand is a money order that was sent back. That's the news from America that he really wanted to hear. Both of these, I think, become important in the book in a way we might talk about. But what we're discussing in class also is using letters as sources. And on the one hand, we might glean factual information from them. On the other hand, we might be aware of tropes and conventions,
Yeah.
and it might be the expected thing to express sentiments of homesickness and exile if you're writing to a particular audience. Did you play around with that, with other letters, or think about letters in that way?
Oh, I did big
yeah.
time. And of course, the other aspect is that there were things that they probably never put in the letters because they knew it would hurt the people back home if they were to say, this is awful.
Yeah.
Or I
yeah.
have to work 15 hours a day and I'm trying to write something and I'm dead on my feet and, I don't have a whole lot of news because I do the same thing every day. The letters obviously are not, they're documentary in one sense, and then also they're fictions. They are fictions of desired outcomes. When I found out that a letter that was sent back to Ireland without the money order in it was known as an empty letter, I just thought it's so heartbreaking because, there was nothing that could fill the letter that would take the place of the money. And some of the need for that money was necessity, and some of it was eventually, I imagine, habit. They got kind of used to, and that gender thing that's in that painting is interesting. And this idea of the daughters of the house being shipped off to send back money orders to the sons of the house. There's a little bit of me then that also sort of rankles slightly at that, and of course, as more and more children were sent out and sending back the money orders, and there's a point at which you think, well, how necessary was it really? I mean, in the beginning, yeah, but was it still necessary when there were 6 daughters out there sending the money orders back? Or was there a little bit of, we'll add on an extra room, we'll make an improvement, we'll make a bigger dowry, it'll be nicer, and then, I mean, obviously I'm bringing modern feminist perspective to bear on it, but there is a bit of me that wonders about the whole sort of gender breakdown of the roles that were laid onto these young women.
Yeah, and I think you drive that to a firm conclusion in the book. The book has an argument at the end.
Slightly speculative. Argument,
well, as I read it, if you think of the scale of Irish emigration, you can make a case that it is the dominant fact in modern Irish history.
Yes.
2 out of every 5 Irish-born people were living abroad in your period. 2 out of every 5 were living abroad. Phrases that are kind of scarred into my mind through scholarship are phrases like emigration as a relentlessly efficient national enterprise. I'm quoting David Fitzpatrick. Children being reared as emigrants. Yeah. And then in your book, the women of the houses moving abroad to live and work in the houses of others. So it's, a strong case that modern Ireland per se, and that's the case I think you leave us with at the end, rests on this social phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are other historians who say, no, there's no link between the remittances and between what happened as a result of the various land acts. And they say, look, the money that was used for the purchase of farms under the land acts did not come from remittances. Here's where it came from. And they're very clear about where it came from. And that may well be right. I'm sure it is right. But I also think that money bred confidence. And without that confidence, perhaps there wouldn't have been, I suppose, the interest in taking a risk, like borrowing this quite significant sum of money from the British government to buy out your land, to buy out your small farm under the Land Act. So I think the money created a kind of a culture of security and strength, out of which came this massive change in Irish land ownership in the 2 decades at the start of the 20th century. So it's not a direct line, and I don't want to claim that it's a direct line and that I have somehow discovered something that all other historians have missed. It's not that, but what I'm suggesting is that it's a dotted line, but it's a line. It's a line. I think it's hard to argue that there isn't a connection between that money coming in and the huge social and historical and economic changes that happened in Ireland in the 2 decades at the start of the 20th century.
Yeah, I agree. I want to open it up to the audience. Before we do that, could I put you on the spot and ask you to read something for us?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
This is a surprise question, and I did not prep you for that. Would you read a passage for us?
Will I just choose one?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
okay, all right, I will. Can I say just before I do that, just how incredibly grateful I am to have this book published with New York University Press. It's a dream publisher for me and for Ellen. As I say in the acknowledgements, the fact that she has a home now in New York, I mean, it's just it's such a beautifully poetic end to the story. Can I also say how much I love the physical book and what a beautiful production it is. In my wildest dreams, I couldn't have imagined it being as handsome as it is. So thank you very much for all of that. And to be part of the Glucksman Diaspora list is a special privilege for me as well. Okay, so I think maybe I better read one of these sonnets since I've been banging on about them. So let's see. So I do this thing that we're told that we ought to do whenever we're embarking on any kind of historical inquiry. I follow the money. So I want to read one that's about this. Because, the thing that I haven't said so far that I feel is important to say is that I think there must have been an excitement to this life. I mean, obviously there was a loss. There was quite possibly a traumatic wrench from home. It must have been quite terrifying in some ways to be 20 years of age and to be, I mean, I doubt very much that she was on so much as a train before, never mind a transatlantic ship. And to arrive in New York and to see New York must have been terrifying, but I think it must also have been a little bit exciting, don't you think? I mean, with the worst of the journey over, don't you think that she looked at that skyline and thought, yeah, this this is okay. And then she got off. She gets off and she starts eating food that she's never eaten before. I mean, they did not eat oysters in Glenavu in South County Sligo, and things like oranges and all the extraordinary different kinds of fruit and food and the clothes that people wore, which I think might have been of interest to her. And the way that people looked and the way that they sounded, I think there must have been a kind of a fizz of excitement. You're 20 years of age. I can't imagine that this was all bad news. So, and also, she earned money, and she had no chance of doing that. Had she stayed in Ireland, she had maybe a chance of being a shop girl, maybe a chance of working on somebody else's farm, but for a tiny, tiny fraction of money in comparison with what she earned here. It wasn't a fortune that she earned here, but I'll tell you, working there, the same probably hard work for a lot less money can't have been very attractive to her to stay, which is why so many of them came. But can you imagine being handed money for your labour? So you've always been working, you've always been working in the family and on the farm, and then somebody says, here's your payment. I just think that must be very exciting too. And I think, you must love that money. I imagine that she took that money upstairs and I imagine her wearing the money to begin with before she took it off to the bank to send it back home again. But I imagine that money was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. So again, I don't want to say that it was all miserable, although I'm sure a fair amount of it was. But I also think there was a kind of just an excitement to it and an ease to it, because she brought, in the case of Ellen, she brought her sisters. She brought 5 of her sisters out afterwards. Okay. They paid me the months in dollar bills, 2 quarters a luck penny. For the first time in my life, I learned to make friends with money. I slept on my bills, a clever sleep, to wish them 10 bills more, the penny I sewed in my apron lest I forget why I came here. At the savings bank, $5 bought an order for £1 for the rent back home. Once that was sent, we'd set aside a little by and by for a hat or dress. For who wants to be serving 6 days a week and still look like a servant on day 7? Did I mind that money I skivvied for should slip through my father's open hands, God bless him, into the greedy maw of a landlord who'd demand every farthing owed, good harvest or bad, no matter if a man was sick or if his children starved? My 7 days a week hard labour, grime and ash and slack, converted to carriages, jewels and law. That's some magic trick.
Will you take some questions?
I would be happy to take some questions. You better come up with some, or else I'm going to read more sonnets. Yeah, Colin.
Mike, for you, Colin. Yeah.
I found the sections extraordinary that you wrote, the research you did on the magazines.
Yeah.
And I found it very affecting just to read about the business of Bridget and the maid and the Irish maid and how prevalent this was. I just wondered, as you went through in the column, as you went through those publications, I mean, I felt, I mean, angry isn't the word really, but I was very shocked by it.
Yeah.
I mean, were you?
I was shocked by it. I was shocked by the circumstances of their lives as well. I mean, that 15 hours a day, that's not an exaggeration. That comes up in a lot of the research. 6.5 days a week. They got a half day off to go to mass. And if they were in a place that was kind to them, they'd be allowed to have visitors to the house. And if they weren't, then they didn't really see other people, you know, except at mass. So, I mean, they were at the mercy of other people's kindness or lack of kindness, for sure. And that was just their immediate circle. And beyond that, they were at the mercy. They were the butt of the joke. I mean, I found a mountain of material that I really had to trim down to the kind of extreme examples that I've included in the book. But the biddy was the joke, and it was the joke in newspapers, and it was the joke on the vaudeville stage, where people would dress up as Irish servants and speak in funny accents and do really foolish things. And it was an ongoing source of smug delight, really, in society circles. It was also a source of some disturbance, because the thing was that people didn't really like having Irish women in the house because they were a bit too unbiddable. And also, they didn't come from those kind of houses, so they didn't really know how to clean them. They were dependent on somebody to show them how to clean them, and to polish silver and to scrub tile floors. They'd never seen these things before. So there was a steep learning curve. So depending on where you chose to enter with your observations, you either saw them as ignorant and dirty and feckless and all the rest of it, or you saw them as being capable of change and development and quite ingenious in a way, in terms of being able to adapt. But the machinery of mockery certainly found a very handy target in these women, who sounded odd, who sometimes spoke back because they didn't understand the conventions of servility because they weren't bred to it. And so they were unbiddable to some extent, and this was part of what made them funny, was because they were so low on the social scale and still they were proud. And that kind of juxtaposition was an awkward one for people to get their heads around, and for employers to get their heads around as well. Yeah.
Speaking of the beautiful cover, Vona, is there a connection between the watch and the chain and the one you're wearing today?
Yes, there is. Oh, well observed, Martha. Well
Please
done.
tell us.
It's the same one. It's the same one. And if you, so the image that's on the back that's the inner workings of the watch, which when you open this at the back, that's what you see. And in the book, so this, my mother gave this to me, and it doesn't work, and I tried to have it fixed, but it can't be fixed. And I like that it can't be fixed. I don't want it to be fixed. It's fine that it's stuck in its ways. But my mother was born here in New York in 1924. And this watch, when I did some research on it, I found that it dates from the early 1920s. And so I don't know for sure that it was given to her as a gift when she was born. But I think, right, okay, her parents certainly didn't buy gold watches. They weren't in a position to do that. Her father's folks were back in Ireland, and I don't think that gold watches for American babies would have been high on their list of priorities. So I think, yeah, it's not inconceivable that it came from Ellen, you know. So I don't know for sure, but yeah, well, I'm prepared to believe that it's possibly the one thing that may have passed through her hands that still exists. Yeah. There's no photograph of her. There's no letter written by her. There's nothing that I know for sure was her property in the world, other than her story and her bloodline. That's the proof. And her grave out in Queens, out in Calvary in Queens. Yeah.
Hi, I loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering, do you think there was a bond between the sisters, or were they separated in the same way in separate houses, doing their, the work within the house?
Impossible for me to know, but there was one sister who was Aunt Sarah, as my mother called her, who was known as Sally, who was the youngest of the family. And I think that there was some kind of a bond there, but so here's the funny thing, right? So since I've published the book, and I wrote what I wrote in this combination that I've already described of research and ignorance and projected fantasy, or whatever you want to call it. So then this sometimes happens. You publish a book and somebody comes and says, I know a little bit about this story. Yeah. So I have discovered a cousin called Michael Morgan, who was able to tell me. So he would be maybe, a third cousin, 15 times removed. I don't know exactly what. But anyway, he is the descendant of one of Ellen's sisters, right? So he was able to tell me a little, and he thinks that somebody may have a photograph, and there's work going on to see if that photograph can be found. But he had the idea that those two sisters lived together. So that would seem to suggest that even though mostly they would have had jobs in separate places, right, that still they found a way to keep the network, the family network, intact in some way. Yeah.
And was there any evidence in your research about what happened to these women as they got older and stopped?
Well, I spent an awful long time looking for her later on, and she kind of disappeared. There were some Ellens that don't seem to have been plausible versions of her, really and truly. And it's all in the book, who they are, but they don't fit with her. So I don't really know what happened. And I wonder because, so her daughter came back to Ireland in 1936, but her son didn't. So he had served in the American Army during the First World War. And his descendants still live, I believe, in New Jersey. So maybe she went to live with them. I'm not really sure, but I know I didn't know what year she died when I started off on this research, and I only knew that when I stood looking at her grave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
The letters.
Yeah.
I thought your interpretation of that was very harsh, and I think, I suppose I look at my own family history because I've been doing a lot of research, and there's so many ways that those letters could have. It could have been less stark, I suppose. There's so many ways. There's so many ways of interpreting how the letters never got passed on, I suppose.
Yes, But I have to say that harshness was part of the story that was told to me. Yeah.
Interesting.
I didn't, that's a detail I didn't make up.
Yeah.
But you see, I do think, maybe especially in Ellen's case, because she did have this experience of bringing her 2 children back to Ireland and leaving them there for 13 years, and then bringing them back just before World War I. Now there's no way that was not traumatic for everyone concerned. Traumatic for the kids because, well, they lose their mother, but they're very young at that point. But then at the age of like 13 and 12, they have to leave the world that they've known, which is the world that was her world, but they're leaving it earlier and they're coming back to their mother, who's a stranger to them. So there is all of these lines of connection, of family connection. I think a lot of this was really quite traumatic. And I think that some of the experiences that people had were not the sort of, cozy surviving against all the odds and making a go of it and climbing their way generation by generation up the social ladder. I think there were places where there was a kind of collapse in the whole thing because, it was just so damn difficult.
Yeah.
And because they were mocked, and because it was hard work, and because they were alone, and because their marriages didn't always work, and because they had a burden of trying to work out how to raise children when they didn't have a support network, and so on and so forth. And because of all of that, I think there were lives in which all of this experience meant not a positive forward march, but I think something that was a lot more like a kind of hiatus and collapse and a sort of not dealing with things, but maybe then sudden outbursts of things that happened that were quite extreme, or to use your word, harsh.
Yeah.
But I think, how do you express hurt and except through harshness, really? Yeah. Well, it's one way to do it. There are other ways to do it, better ways to do it, but that's certainly a way that happens, yeah. Yeah, Caroline. There is a mic, and there's another one at the back, and then we have Caroline here. Yeah.
I'm curious. You mentioned support networks.
Yep.
I haven't read your book yet, but as far as I know, first, second generation Irish immigrants did have built support networks through the church, through other types of activities. And does that come into Ellen's story at all as well? Do you provide a picture of any kind of? Because it seems like you're painting a picture of someone who's very alone. Is there a kind of a support network that comes into her story as well?
Well, yes, there is to some extent, Eric. But I should say that the research, the first draft of this book was at least 3 times longer than what I've ended up with. And I had done a lot of research on these sort of parish fairs, and there has been there's good research on these events, which were, as you say, an important kind of social network. And then I don't know, I just couldn't make it work in a way that was interesting, like very important in one way, but also in another way, so big deal, once a month you go to a fair, and like, I don't know, I just couldn't, somebody else would make a better job of it, but I couldn't get it to work. Also, there were. I mean, they did meet people. They did get married. So they were meeting people of the opposite sex somewhere, and they were meeting them mostly at dances and at those kind of church events. So it's there, but there were political networks. Again, that would have taken me into a whole other rabbit hole. There were women who were raising money for movements back in Ireland, and there has been good research done on that as well. But I couldn't be glib about that, and I couldn't give it the space that it would have needed to really make it work in the story. So yes, you're right. There had to be some networks, but I'm not sure how much of a network there was for a deserted wife with 2 kids. And I'll tell you why I say that with such kind of confidence, because if there had been a network for her to use, why would she have brought her children back and left them in Ireland on their own? I mean, you would do an awful lot to try and keep those children with you. So that's why I'm thinking, maybe the networks were not for the likes of her. Maybe the networks were for the politically engaged women, or maybe they were for the religiously committed women. I'm not really sure, but I'm thinking a deserted wife with 2 infants. I don't think there was a lot coming her way. Yeah. Caroline, you had a question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vona. This is a brilliant discussion. My question is about your writing process. So there's so much about the act of reading that privileges the visual and sight. And this book is so preoccupied with sound and voice. And I was wondering kind of what you imagined for your readers in encountering it, and what you might envision or imagine a reader would hear in how they're experiencing the book.
You know, when I did my talk in the Cullman Centre that Martha referenced earlier, it was the first time I'd ever aired the project. And afterwards, some people said to me, oh, here's how you would find out what a woman from South County Sligo would have sounded like exactly. And here's where the linguistic research will help you with that. And I thought, again, if I go into that, I'm never going to get out of it again. And I'm never going to have the confidence then to be able to write her, because I'm always going to hear those kind of judgy voices telling me, no, she wouldn't have said that word. So I just thought, okay, I'm going to write according to the voice that I can project onto her, that to me seems a credible voice. Can I say that this would be useful research for anybody who wants to find out exactly what a woman from Glenavu, South County Sligo would have sounded like? Then I would say probably you'd want to back that up with research elsewhere. But I wanted people to hear the voice that I'm giving her. And I wanted people to be able to see some kind of version of, so I don't really physically describe her very much. I sometimes describe her clothes, or I give her a prop, just so that people will have a visual tag. But in a way, I want people to also imagine their own female people in their line. I want them to be able to fill in that space that I've called Ellen with a kind of version. Because actually, one of the things I've noticed from talking about this book is people say to me, "Oh yeah, that's I've heard a version of that story too." And one of the things that I really like is that people have said to me, because Ellen, she's not too honest about her age always. So sometimes in the census records, there's a year on or a year off, but or maybe even more than that. I was talking about this with a woman. I said, "Oh yeah, no, that my grandmother, she said she would never let me come into the doctor's surgery with her because she always had to say what her actual age was there, and there were so many lies about her age." So I do think that there's something about this story that's, well, obviously it's not particular to Ellen. It was a general story, this story of women who came over from Ireland and worked in these jobs and had some version of this experience that Ellen had. And I don't want it to be, so particular that nobody can project their own story into the space. So I hope that I've left enough space for people to be able to do that. Yeah. You're very quiet on this side of the room.
We'll take one more question from this side of the room. Yeah.
Oh, this is just a real little one. You used the word unbiddable a couple of times. What is that word?
So an unbiddable person is somebody who isn't obedient.
Is not obedient.
Yeah. And if you're a servant, you're supposed to be obedient. That's the first rule of service, is you do what you're told. But, a lot of the complaints about Irish servants centred around the fact that they didn't always do what they were told, and that they'd answer back, or that they'd look their employers in the eye, and they weren't supposed to look their employers in the eye. They were supposed to look down. So there's a point where Ellen's getting paid, and I make sure that I have her say that when she was getting paid, she always looked in the eye the person who was giving her the money, because I think, yeah, I like that. I mean, did that happen? I don't know, but I like that. I like that idea that she was proud enough to say, you're giving me money in exchange for the labour I've done. I don't have to look at my feet at this moment, you know. But certainly a lot of that kind of that reductive, abusive version of the Irish biddy portrayed them as being, disobedient, argumentative, corrective of their employers, which, as you can imagine, didn't go down too well. So yeah, but it's funny, isn't it funny, how that word unbiddable and then the word biddy, yeah, which biddy is short for Bridget, but they were known as biddies. It was like a collective term. The Irish biddy was this servant woman, but I think maybe some part of my poet's brain pulled out that word unbiddable because of that word biddy and sort of coupled the two together. Yeah.
So Vona, you've been telling us about Ellen O'Hara so wonderfully in the book and in this great conversation. We'll have a book signing out on this floor, and we'd like to invite everybody to join us for a reception downstairs. But Vona, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. And thank you to Martha, and thank you to Helena, and thank you to Caroline as well. And thank you all very much for coming along this evening. Okay.